Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Don Grennan with Continuity Insights, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Winter Weather Preparedness and Response, which will be presented by Don Schmidt, CEO of Preparedness, LLC. Today's broadcast is also being sponsored by OnSolve. Before we get started today, I'd like to review a quick few items with you. Throughout today's presentation, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the questions pane of your control panel, and you can send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these, and Don will address them at the conclusion of the webinar. I also just want to remind you that today's webinar will also be recorded for later on-demand viewing, and as a registered participant, you will receive a link to this recording. I would now like to introduce our presenter. Don Schmidt is the CEO of Preparedness, LLC, a consulting firm specializing in risk assessment, loss prevention, hazard mitigation, emergency management, business continuity, and crisis management. He has more than 35 years' experience working with some of the largest companies in the world on their preparedness programs. His roots came from the insurance industry when he conducted hundreds of property surveys and conducted many loss investigations. Don is a past chair of the committee that writes the NFPA 1600 and a member of 3 other standards development committees. He is also a DRI instructor, a former instructor for the State Emergency Management, and was a full visiting professor in Massachusetts Maritime Academy's Masters in Emergency Management program. Additionally, he's the editor, co-author, and contributing author of 6 books and the author of numerous published articles on emergency management, business continuity, terrorism, and related subjects. Please welcome Don Schmidt.
Thank you, Don, and good day, everyone. Great to be with you. Hopefully the weather is not too frigid or snowy where you are, but we're now in the heart of winter. Before I get into the depth of the program, I always like to kind of muse and think back about winter, and I think the beauty of winter time with the fresh coating of snow and maybe a little bit of ice and the sun coming up, just beautiful. When we were kids, when we had a major storm, no school, great for us, not so great for mom and dad. Sledding and tobogganing or ice skating with the family, just lots of fun. But then you get into adulthood and you got a major storm and you can't get the car out of the garage or down the driveway. You got to shovel all that snow or maybe even shovel it off the roof. That happened once. And then the power goes out. Some of these storms, the power goes out. And a few hours is not a big deal, but after more than a day or so, it's tough to stay in your house when there's no power, no heat. The kids are going crazy. But I was a firefighter for 13 years, and fighting fires in frigid weather is a challenge. I remember going into a burning building right around Christmas one year and coming out to change my air tank and my self-contained breathing apparatus, and everything just froze up as soon as I got outside. It was so cold. Couldn't. So, kind of the message there is it's tough for emergency services during the winter time when there's, severe weather. It means we've got to be better prepared because they may be delayed in response or their response may be challenged by the weather. We all probably slipped on the ice or snow or whatever, so it's also time for employee injuries or customer injuries because of the snowfall. But I conducted a lot of loss investigations in my career, and I saw a lot of water damage claims from freeze-ups, whether it's domestic water piping, sprinkler piping, boiler failures, a lot of problems. And many of those problems could have been prevented. And that's going to be the focal point of today's presentation. And then I'll also get into kind of response mode as well. And if you're wondering, that's my son standing on the snow pile. That was after we had front-end loaders in to move snow out of the way back in February of 2015. A lot of snow that year. Okay, today's agenda, I'm going to talk about risk assessment, for your preparedness program, emergency management, business continuity, crisis management, whatever you call it, but really begins with a risk assessment, understanding what can happen. So we'll talk about that. Then I'm going to get into a lot of preparedness steps, inspection, testing, maintenance, a lot of things you can do to prepare a facility before the severe winter weather, whether it's Arctic freeze, blizzards, whatever. Then I'll get into kind of response mode. responding to the storms. And I also spent a little bit of time talking about safety. Unfortunately, winter weather can be catastrophic. Lots of lives are lost in winter storms. So we're going to talk about some of the safety things that can be done. And as Don mentioned at the beginning, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to type those into the chat section. Okay, cost of winter storms. We look at insured losses. Last year, $2.1 billion, $3 billion the year before, but that's insured losses. I used to work in the insurance industry for a number of years, and I always look at those numbers with a grain of salt because a lot of losses from winter storms, severe winter weather, Arctic freeze, a lot of it's not insured. So those numbers could be much, much higher. So there's a cost associated with winter, and winter preparedness can hopefully bring those costs down for your company. Now, if we look at some costly storms, 1993, storm affected 24 states, $5 billion in losses. One storm. I've always been very concerned about ice storms because they can be deadly. And we look back to January 98, the great ice storm, which was in northern New England, upstate New York, and Quebec, Canada, 44 deaths, over $4 billion in losses. Now, if you look at that graphic image, that's a high voltage transmission tower that toppled in that storm. They had 3 inches of ice accretion. A friend of mine living in Montreal said they had these huge front end loaders that were scraping the streets to remove the ice. Power was out in some areas for weeks. So it was a crippling ice storm. In Massachusetts, the last big ice storm we had, 2008, in north central Massachusetts up into New Hampshire, a little bit of Vermont. And again, that was very, very challenging and also resulted in some fatalities. Great ice storm back in 1951. Think of this, 100-mile wide swath affected from Louisiana all the way up into West Virginia. So, we've had some winter storms that cover a great part of the country, causing very significant losses, including loss of life. All right, so risk assessment. Always start off, what can happen? What are the hazards? Obviously bitter cold, Arctic freeze, temperatures below zero, especially for multiple days in a row. And I always used to think back when I worked for an insurance company. The holiday weekend, bitter cold, facilities are going to be vacant, and I know once the weather starts warming up, the claims are going to start coming in because everything freezes, and once the weather warms up, then the water starts flowing, and then the claims start coming in. So cold, rainfall. Yeah, we get some rain in the wintertime, not a problem, but let's say you've had a lot of snow on the rooftop, and then we get a lot of rain on top of it, and that snow acts like a sponge, and all that rain just increases the weight on that rooftop and can result in structural failure. Snow, I love snow. It can be a lot of fun to play in. But when you get 2-3 feet of snow, heavy, wet snow, very, very challenging. Again, snow loading problems on rooftops, very difficult to move the snow out of the way, very difficult for traffic to move around. That's your customers to get to your facility, employees to come and go, supplies to come in, deliveries to go out. Certainly snow on the roads, very, very challenging. And I think back to that winter of 2015, just driving around was a challenge. Snow is a challenge. I just mentioned about some of these big ice storms, a quarter of an inch ice accretion, that starts to generate problems. Now you have an inch of ice accretion, that's going to be a significant ice storm. And anything above that just adds to the extremity of the storm. And wind. Most winter storms, we've got some wind, and those result oftentimes in power outages. But here we want to look at scenarios where we can have a combination of all of these hazards And that's when the impact on safety is very significant, the impact on the property can be significant, and the impact on your business operations can also be very significant. So this risk assessment matrix, just a way to look at it and be able to identify some scenarios. And part of that is your justification for the preparedness activities. All right, so now let's take a look at what you can do to prepare. And I know it's January, we're already in the heart of winter, but still a lot of these things are important. And if there's no snow on the rooftop, somebody should be going out there to check the roof. When I do inspections, I always like to start from the highest low. If I can get to the roof, I want to make sure that roof top is in good condition. Why? Because there are any holes in that membrane in that photograph, that bottom photograph, that allows water to get underneath that membrane, that rubber roof, and then that water will get down into the building below. So we want to check that roof covering. We want to check the flashing, which goes around the perimeter of the roof, because if that flashing is damaged or it's peeling away, that allows the wind to be able to peel back the flashing, to be able to get underneath that roof covering and maybe peel back the roof covering. And that allows the weather to get in and damage. So we're trying here to make sure that that roof covering is in good condition, the flashing is in good condition. But then we take a look at skylights, vents, make sure they're in good condition, secure. Looking at drains, especially important to make sure that drains are clear. We want water on the roof to be able to drain away, to get down through those drains, through the gutters, all the way down and away from the building, and remove the weight of that water, which can be very significant. Now you see in the top picture there, some mechanical equipment. May be a little tough for you to see in that picture, but there's an access panel on the side. I always check all these mechanical equipment to make sure those doors are closed very securely. Because if they're not secure and I found them open up, or panels that were opened and never closed up, those panels with screws, and if whether the door is open or the panel is exposed, these mechanical systems can be impacted by the weather and shut down these critical, HVAC or other types of equipment. And on rooftops, you're going to find a lot of other things. There may be communications antennas, signage, whatever. Want to make sure they're all in good shape so that when the strong winds blow, we will not have any interruption in communications, any interruption in any mechanical system, or any physical damage to the roof when something gets knocked down and blown around on the rooftop. Next point, real important. And I mentioned back to 2015 in Massachusetts, and that 133 inches of snow. I get the chills just thinking about that. 133 inches of snow. I was teaching my graduate course on a Saturday afternoon in January. It's about the third week of January, and I see a tweet from the Weather Service saying a blizzard on Monday. And usually the Weather Service, can forecast that many days in advance. So blizzard, and sure enough, we had the first of two blizzards that winter that occurred on that Monday. It got cold. It stayed cold for 6 weeks, and we had 133 inches of snow. And towards the end of that winter, there were more than 200 structural failures in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, more than 200. There was a cross-docking warehouse terminal not too far from where I lived, 250,000 square feet. By the end of that winter, they had less than a third of their roof still standing. That's now a parking lot today. Business is gone. So heavy snow can result in structural failure. So it's important to be able to understand where you have sections of roof that are likely to accumulate a lot of snow. So we think about, you have a 2-story section, a 1-story section. That 1-story section, where it meets the 2-story section, that's oftentimes where the drifting will occur. You get heavy snow there. If you get rain on top of it, it's going to be a lot of weight in that area. There's some buildings that have all sorts of gabled, where I think of old manufacturing plants used to have a sawtooth roof, so we had peaks and valleys. The snow accumulates in those valleys. And so it's important to understand those areas And then look to see over time, has there ever been any deflection underneath, any cracking, any signs that that roof section is potentially stressed? And if so, action needs to be taken to be able to shore up the strength of that section. But I keep coming back to the last bullet point in this slide, and that's clear the debris. We want to make sure that those drains are clear. We can get water off the rooftop. And the other thing to think about is when the rooftop is clear, just think about how would you access the roof in the wintertime when there's snow to be able to safely remove snow if that is necessary. I'll talk about that in a minute because that can be very, very dangerous. I talk a lot about the rooftop, but now I want to take a look and speak to what may be outside. Any water-filled, water-cooled equipment, process lines, instrumentation. We want to make sure that this equipment is protected against freezing. Instrumentation, process lines go down, operations inside go down. So we want to be able to protect anything that's outside. And again, make sure lubricants are suitable for low temps as well, so that that equipment will run when it is bitter, bitter cold. Any steam traps, liquid drains, anything like that, they should be on the inspection checklist. And I call out outbuildings because I've investigated a number of losses over the years where there was a freeze up in an outbuilding, kind of forgotten about it. And it turns out there was maybe some research going on in that building. There were important records kept in that building back in the day when we used to have a lot of paper records, but still a lot of drawings. And there have been a freeze up sprinkler system, and we have significant water damage. It's because people forgot to check that building. They thought it was unimportant. So, somebody's got to include all those outbuildings, all the outdoor equipment in their inspection checklist in preparation for winter and when we have Arctic freeze or significant storms forecast. It's winter, it's cold outside, and here we're talking about maintain adequate heating. It's kind of a no-brainer, right? Well, there are circumstances where, there's inadequate heat. And I think about situations where there's that extended weekend or a plant shuts down for a week, those times where the heat generated by the process equipment is not going to be there because the process systems are shut down for that week or that long weekend. So there are situations now where we have a lot of people working from home. The employee population in office buildings is limited. So those human walking around that would be able to identify an area where it's cold and somebody should check that out. If they're not there, those human sensors are not able to be able to alert management or facilities that there's a potential problem. So, maintaining adequate heat is going to be a key. Now you see in the top picture a Cleaverbrook slow pressure boiler. Boilers need to be inspected, internally inspected every year. Have to check and make sure all the safety controls work, make sure all the set points are properly set, and that the boiler is going to be good for the wintertime. Hartford Steam Boiler, big boiler machinery insurance underwriter, says their claims start to peak in the beginning of heating season, but they peak right about now in mid to late January. No surprise, that's when these boilers are working overtime to maintain full heat within the building. So it's key to make sure this equipment has been inspected and maintained, as well as it's been properly monitored, so that if there are any potential problems, they'll be detected quickly, so the boiler can be serviced before it goes down. Now, also want to take a look at parts of the building and areas where we have fire protection water supplies, such as the gravity tank you see in the bottom photograph. Also take a look at not just the outbuildings, but sections of the building. It could be areas where we have piping above ceilings, piping beneath floors, piping in walls, that if there is inadequate heat, we're going to have freeze potential. And I've seen it in new buildings where relatively new building, we have a freeze up from a piping that was in the cavity from the exterior wall to the interior wall. And it's just because there was inadequate insulation. So you have new buildings, the first year of operations, key to really maintain surveillance during the cold days of winter. If there's been major renovations, also want to make sure that you keep an eye on those areas that have been renovated. I mentioned the outbuildings. Fire pump houses are critical in a lot of facilities. Dry sprinkler valve closets. These are areas that a lot of people are not that familiar with. Somebody from maintenance checks it from time to time, but these are areas that if the temperature drops below a certain level, a fire pump needs to be at almost at room temperature because there's a diesel engine in there, needs to be kept warm for the diesel to come on and be able to run it at proper efficiency. Dry pipe sprinkler valves are in cold areas. There's a closet around that valve because that valve, there's water in there. And also, I'll show you in a minute about the air compressors and all that's a component of a dry sprinkler valve that needs to be checked periodically as well. But we're looking for underheated areas so that if there's inadequate heat, there's a potential for a freeze up. This slide is focused on inspection, testing, and maintenance of fire protection and life safety systems. I focus on fire protection first because that protects us from fire, and in manufacturing plants, warehouses, a number of plants, fire protection is critically important because of the potential for a significant fire. But also from a freeze preparedness perspective, it's important to check these systems because I've investigated many losses where inadequate maintenance on these systems resulted in freeze-ups. Now, without getting into details of different sprinkler systems, a wet pipe sprinkler system is common in most heated buildings. And so we need to maintain adequate heat. Pretty straightforward. But if we have dry pipe sprinkler systems in unheated buildings, warehouses are probably the best example. These systems have to be maintained, adequate heat for where the wet pipe systems are located, and we need to make sure that we drain the low points, those areas of a dry pipe sprinkler that may accumulate water. And that's natural because we have to test these systems and it floods the pipes with water, then we drain them. We need to make sure any water that may accumulate in the low points, we drain that off so there's no water in the pipes. And a lot of the loss investigations I conducted, they did not identify low points, they didn't drain them, they did not inspect and maintain their system, so when it was bitter cold, the pipe froze up. And I called in at one time, they said, oh, it's leaking over here, and I look over and I could see the dripping and went over to the sprinkler valve, and the valve was still open, and I said, as soon as it warms up in here, we're going to have a flood. So we had to shut down the sprinkler system, drain what they could, and then call in the sprinkler fitter to be able to repair the damage from the freeze up. I want to call your attention now to the generator. Many facilities have generators. From a business continuity perspective, it's great to have a generator to maintain power for all critical circuits. But in my experience, I found that many times generators will fail because if you are operating at a full load situation, meaning operations are all active, the building's fully populated, processes are running, and then the power goes out and that generator kicks on and immediately has to provide full capacity. If it has not been properly maintained, it may not work properly. And I've identified a number of situations where big generators and hospitals have failed, and a lot of that goes back to inadequate maintenance on these generators. So that's a key. If your generator is required by code, such as a hospital, then by code they're required to maintain it to a national standard called NFPA 110. If it's something you put in as part of your business continuity plan to be able to deal with a power outage, that's optional then, but you still should maintain them in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. And that means full load testing at least once a year, as well as appropriate maintenance as qualified by the manufacturer. But many generators are powered by diesel fuel, and oftentimes when I've inspected these facilities, the generator's fuel tank is down to half level. And so, if you've got half a tank of fuel, it's only going to run for half as long as maybe you had expected it to run. So the key point is to keep that fuel tank at least 3/4 full. And I'll talk in a moment, your checklist when we're in the midst of a storm or preparing for a storm to make sure that we can augment that fuel supply. So the key thing here is inspection, testing, and maintenance of these systems and equipment by qualified people. Okay, preparedness for freeze and winter storms. First off, we're taking a look at what personnel do we need. Part of that is for the facility maintenance, do all the checks we just talked about in terms of winter preparedness, those for snow removal, those for being able to communicate with employees to get preparedness information to them to prepare for the storm, taking a look at operations, shutting down operations, or what are your contingencies to deal with the storm. But the goal here is like any emergency operations plan, we need to assign responsibilities for preparing the facility, surveillance, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, and that is monitoring the weather forecasts, understanding the potential impacts, having in place snow removal capabilities, whether that's in-house or whether it's contractors or a combination thereof, make sure that's in place. And then what are you going to do if something happens? We got a leak, we got a pipe break, we've got a problem. So, address various contingencies as part of the emergency operations plan. So make sure contractors, equipment, supplies are available, and that you have the fuel supplies you need on hand. Now we're going to take a look at your production staffing schedules. If you're going into a shutdown and it's bitter cold, then we're going to have to take a look at maintaining adequate heat because the heat producing equipment is shut down. There may not be adequate heat. You may have to augment heat in certain areas. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. But what are you going to do if you lose heat? If you lose heat, now you have to drain wet pipe sprinklers. You've got process equipment that maybe you have to drain. There may be a lot of work to be able to prevent damage if the loss of heat continues for an extended period of time. So contingency plans for loss of heat, electricity, fuel supply, especially for an extended duration outage, and shutdown for production. Impairment handling would be precautions to take if you have to shut down any of your fire protection or life safety systems. And I'll talk about alerting and communications in a minute. I've talked about testing your generators, maintaining adequate fuel supply for them. And the last point here is your employees. We take what's your most important resource? It's your employees. Today, you have the ability to push information out to them about dangers of winter weather, preparedness in case they lose power at their homes. Now, if you have a lot of employees working from home because of COVID, they may be subject to a power outage. They don't have any generator, but obviously you got to take care of their health and welfare of their family. But what is the plan for a power outage, an extended power outage? Also communicate safety information about if you're trapped in your car in severe weather, what to do, what emergency supplies you should have on hand. But the last point here is an important one. I mentioned earlier that severe winter weather can result in many casualties. Improper use of generators can result in carbon monoxide poisoning. We have trees falling or people trying to take down fallen tree branches and get struck by those and injured. Of course, the slips and falls. When trees come down, power lines come down, we've got to treat them as energized. Hopefully, nobody will be electrocuted. And then people working outside in this bitter, bitter cold may be subject to frostbite or hypothermia if they're outside for too long and not properly protected. So this is an opportunity to protect employees as well. Now, extreme cold, certainly the Weather Service is going to give us kind of some warning. There'll be local weather advisories, but in this situation here, it's alert staff and be able to activate your incident management plans. I keep coming back to maintaining adequate heat within the building, supplementing that if necessary. And the inclination today to save money is turn the thermostats down. Well, in my house, when we were forecast to have very, very cold temperatures, I would go around the house and open up the cabinets underneath the sink because there's water pipes there. Any areas where I've got water pipes that may be under a cabinet, I want to make sure that there is the ability of the heat to be able to penetrate into those areas. Steps like that to recognize where there is a potential for freezing, what area, and taking some steps to be able to allow heat or to augment heat to make sure we don't have any freeze-ups in those areas. But we got to monitor the weather, monitor the temperatures. Some facilities have security guards. Other companies will have staff that will come in and periodically go through a building if it's unattended. But we want to have those human sensors walking through the facility. Now, if a guard has got winter cap on and gloves and coat and dressed like a snowman walking through, may not be able to detect areas that are cold. And I want to go back to one loss I investigated. It was a warehouse in Quincy, Massachusetts, right next to the city of Boston. And it was a warehouse, an older warehouse, and in the boiler room, a small pane of glass in the boiler room broke out. And that allowed the bitter cold temperatures to get into the boiler room. There was a 3/4-inch copper tube, the feed water for that boiler. It froze up. So think about a 3/4-inch diameter copper pipe that froze up. It broke and water started discharging, and it put 3 inches of water on the basement of this warehouse. And they had lamps and things that they imported from the Far East, and they were in cardboard boxes. Well, a box soaks up all that water, then they start collapsing. And this was many years ago, and it was $250,000 to $500,000 loss, all back to a pane of glass that broke out and a 3/4-inch line that froze up. So it doesn't take much to cause some great problems. So monitoring temperatures, having staff to go through the building, all areas of the building to be able to detect a problem and be able to take prompt action. And part of that inspection is checking those sprinkler valves, checking the compressors on the dry pipe systems. If that compressor is running a lot, that's an indication there's a problem because they should only come on sparingly. It should be infrequent. So if the air compressor on a dry valve is running a lot, that's an indication of a problem. But looking around to see any water, dripping in areas where there shouldn't be any water, any puddles on the floor, any signs of freeze up, and be able to get maintenance or qualified contractor in to take care of those problems immediately. Now, supplemental heat, we see a lot of space heaters brought in the homes as well as businesses. Really, you need to check with your local fire department to find out what's approved because there can be a carbon monoxide problem in a home particularly, but there's a great fire hazard as well. And I remember as a firefighter responding to a building fire where somebody was using a space heater too close to a couch, fell asleep, and woke up and the couch was on fire. If we have a kerosene or propane heater that's used improperly, in a manufacturing, a warehouse facility, whatever, unsupervised, not adequate ventilation or fire protection, you could have a very, very significant fire. So you got to be very careful there. Any liquid-filled heater, if approved, should have a tip-over sensor which would shut it off if it gets struck. So you got to be careful where we use those, where we locate them, and make sure that staff monitor them and provide a fire watch. But the last point here is, if it's bitter cold, heat is lost, you have to take action to prevent freezing. If freezing does occur, you bring in contractors to deal with frozen pipes. You cannot allow them to use any torch. Again, as firefighter responded to building fires, contractors using torches, they burn down buildings. There's a proper way to shut down systems, drain them safely, and then be able to make repairs. If a system is shut down, though, you need to make sure that the fire department is notified and that the insurance company is also notified, and you take full impairment handling precautions. Essentially, take precautions to make sure that adequate fire prevention is in place so you don't have a fire when that sprinkler system is out of service. Okay, response to severe winter weather. First off, as part of your incident management team, there should be personnel that are assigned to facilities maintenance, snow removal, surveilling the property for adequate heat, coordinating with contractors that might be needed. Again, you have a team so the roles and responsibilities are clearly delineated. And if there's coordination between you as a tenant and a property management firm with outside security, again, got to figure that out in advance so that we've really got, it's a clear game plan of who's going to do what. And human resources is a part of this in terms of communicating with employees as well. Now we take a look at surveillance. Now we can monitor the weather forecasts and weather radar and a lot of information, from our smartphone today. If you know where to look, if you know what it means, but there are a lot of great tools out there today as well. And I want to, call out OnSolve, the sponsor of this webinar, through their Stabilitas capabilities, their critical event management platform, you can get notifications right to your smartphone. And I always told my graduate students that it's critically important to minimize the time to detect there's a problem. So if you think about that, minimize the time to detection, maximizes the time you have to be able to react, to be able to respond. So if you're immediately aware of a problem where the heating system is down, you've got a plan in action, you've got a contractor that fix that, or you have capabilities in-house, you get it back up and running, and we don't have a significant problem. So we really need to be aware very quickly there's a problem. So proper surveillance and detection using technologies that are available to us today can be very, very helpful. In the situation analysis, that process of figuring out, what's the weather forecast, what's happening now locally, how is that weather going to change, how is that going to impact in terms of freeze-ups, and so forth. That's a very, very important part of your emergency operations plan. And then you need to communicate. You need to communicate with employees. You might have contractors. So there are a lot of people that might need to be notified. Again, the mass notification system, including OnSolve, are great capability. You can pre-program the list into these systems and be able to select, we need to notify this team, and you can even have a template for a message. The goal is detect a problem, use your technologies to quickly get the help that you need, and then be able to communicate on an ongoing basis to manage the incident. So continuing on in response to storms, I go back to my experience of loss investigations as well as a firefighter responding into buildings when there's a pipe leak, for example. And we don't know that building, and we respond to the building, and oftentimes the people at the building, they don't know where the shutoff valves are. So one of the things you can do is to make sure that you've documented the locations of all the shutoff valves and the areas that those shutoff valves cover. And that should be part of your emergency operations plan. And actually, that's even pointed out in NFPA 1620, which is one of the committees that I'm on. It's on pre-incident planning. But document this information, make sure it's readily available, maybe even communicate to the fire department, but certainly with whoever's going to be at the building, security guard or whoever, so that it's very, very clear how do you shut down a system. And that is not just water systems like domestic water and fire protection water, but also electrical, HVAC, and so forth. You don't want to be in a situation where water's flowing and you don't know where the valve is to shut them down. And they're not always nice and neat where we got a nice big sign on the door that says sprinkler control valves. In older buildings, I can remember crawling through a ventilation duct to get to a sprinkler valve. It was in the old part of Boston, kind of crazy, but that exists today. Impairment handling precautions, you see the red tags. If you have to shut down any sprinkler systems, fire pumps, life safety systems, should be tagged to out of service, notify the fire department, take precautions while those systems are down, get them back up and running as quickly as you can. In terms of cleanup, repairs, that's your contractor list. Again, you should have a good list from any of the emergency service companies that can come in with water vacuums and remove water, those that can come in with tarpaulins or make temporary repairs, whether it's the window glass, whether it's some sort of a problem with the roof, whatever it might be. Have that list of contractors available so that you immediately can contact them. If you need to have some sort of an open purchase order in place, some companies are pretty tough about that, have those in place. But that way, if something happens, you can take immediate action and get help in very quickly. Snowstorms, key point here is going to be one of heavy snow, maintaining access for emergency vehicles, clearing the outsides of exit doors so that people can get out of the building if there's an emergency. Make sure those fire hydrants, sprinkler valves are accessible. Monitoring snow loading and any damming of ice dams at the bottom of gutters, whatever that's going to prevent the drainage of water off the rooftop. You want to check these things out periodically if it's safe to do so. We don't want anybody to get hurt. Clearing heavy snow off of rooftops can be very dangerous. And going back to the winter of 2015, lives were lost. Companies were so desperate to get their rooftops cleared, they were hiring amateurs to go up on the roof and shovel roofs. And people fell through skylights, fell off roofs. They damaged roofs because they didn't know what they were doing. So it has to be properly planned for if you're going to do that. But we're monitoring for any deflections in the roof, what we call these ponding and deflection cycles. And I mentioned those changes in roof elevation, where you can expect heavy accumulation of snow. But we want to look for, any deflections in suspended ceilings, any indication there's a problem with the roof. And if so, that area needs to be vacated, cordoned off so nobody go into that area. If it's safe to get up on a roof and take snow off, fine. But it may also be a predictor of a failure of that rooftop. But the goal here is to monitor for any problems with roof snow loading, take action that you can safely do. If there is a potential for structural failure, to take action to make sure that everybody is out of harm's way. Now, surface water flooding is also a challenge. Storm drains get blocked by all the snow. Now we have maybe rain, we have snow melt. We need for that water to drain away. If we don't, we're going to have a significant ice hazard for slips and falls from motor vehicles, and that generates a lot of claims every winter for workers' comp and general liability. I'm sure your risk managers are well aware of that. So we need to look to make sure that we can get water draining away safely and minimize ice accumulation. Okay, continued safety. I mentioned earlier, your employees are your most important resource. Whether they're in the office or they're at home, and today many may be working from home, working remotely, safety is most important. I mentioned high winds, ice storms, heavy snow, power lines down. First and foremost, everybody needs to know power line is down, stay far away from it, assume it is energized, dial 911 for appropriate assistance. Sometimes we have gas leaks. And again, I've seen ice fall off of rooftops and come down and cause damage below to cars below, even falling down on gas meters and causing a gas leak. So there are lots of scenarios where you could have a gas leak. You smell gas, get everybody out, dial 911. I talked about frostbite and hypothermia. So if you've got employees that are working outside in extreme cold, they've got to be properly dressed. You've got to monitor them. If you've got employees out there spending a lot of time with snow removal, got to monitor them as well because we also have a lot of injuries and heart attacks in wintertime of people trying to deal with heavy snow. I mentioned about snow loading on rooftops and the hazards of working on rooftops. Anybody up there, you got to monitor that. You got somebody there, a safety watch in place to make sure if there's a problem on the rooftop, you'll be aware of it immediately. You can call for help. I mentioned icicles. Sometimes it is peak roofs, and the snow and ice will slide off and then dislodge the icicles, and those icicles come down as spears. I've seen those curved roofs. Oftentimes, at a certain point in time, a heavy accumulation of snow will just slide away, and you get many, many pounds of snow that can come right down next to the building. So you need to barricade sometimes around buildings if you've got a potential for snow or ice to fall to the ground below. And always looking for your parking lots, your driveways, looking to make sure we've got good sight lines, that we've taken care of any ice accumulation to make it safe for motor vehicle traffic and for pedestrians. There's good visibility for pedestrians moving. With those high snow piles, it's dangerous just driving around because you got to put your nose out to be able to see whether any cars are coming. And the roads are typically narrower because of the accumulated snow pushed out of the way by all the snow plows. That is the conclusion of my remarks here. I want to call your attention to some resources. I put together a checklist to self-evaluate an emergency management, business continuity, crisis management program. So that's a download from the Preparedness LLC website. And I've also curated hundreds of hyperlinks to a lot of great information, some of which I mentioned in today's webinar. So Hartford Steam Boiler, or FM Global, which is a major property insurance company. There's some great resources from those companies, as well as a lot of government sources, and I've organized them on the Preparedness LLC website. So if you're looking for something, these are very good hyperlinks. There are very few commercial. Most of these are .govs or some edu and some very recognized insurance company resources. So I call your attention to that. And if you come up with a link you think I should add, by all means, please let me know. So that concludes my remarks. I want to see whether we have any questions. So I'm going to turn it back to Don. Don?
Okay, thank you, Don. Great presentation, a lot of great information, and obviously, as everybody can see on the screen right now, a lot of great links for additional information. So we do have a little bit of time left, so let's field a few questions. And I want to remind everybody that you can still submit your questions, your additional questions, using the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So Don, our first question is, from a business continuity perspective, what weather scenario do you see as most challenging and why?
I mentioned during the presentation my fear of ice storms, and that's why I identify ice storms as the most significant scenario, because they can be long duration. The impacts can last weeks, and power is going to be out, telecommunications are going to be out, and the restoration of power and telecommunications could be extended because the crews can't even get down the streets to be able to repair their lines. At the same time, now you've got a facility where even if your generator is 96 hours of fuel, it's going to run out. You may not be able to get replenishment. So it's a very, very difficult situation. I think that ice storms occur across a good part of the continental United States, and certainly Alaska as well. So I would look at ice storm scenarios. I've done some tabletop exercises on those for private clients as well as some municipalities, and they're eye-opening when you think about the potential implications of an ice storm and what you should do to prepare for them.
Okay, thank you. Our next question has to do with the pandemic, and the question is, does the COVID-19 pandemic have any impact on winter weather preparedness?
We think today with so many people working from home, then each of those employees within their home really need to take steps to be more resilient. But most people in their homes can't afford to have a generator. I had one, but that's because that's been my business to be prepared. But so thinking about what you would do if the power goes out, think about backup for telecom. I know that when the power goes out, the demand for cellular communications becomes greater. But if it's a long duration event, then the generators for cell towers go down, and so you lose your cellular service as well as your wired internet that went down previously. So I think everybody's got to think about their own business continuity plan, working from home, and then also address the safety issues, which I think are very important. Everybody should have an emergency supplies kit in their home, in their car, if they're in a situation where they may be trapped on the road with severe winter weather.
Okay, thank you, Don. Looks like this next question is directly for you, and it's, what would your priority be for winter weather preparedness?
I go back to my fundamentals. From a safety standpoint, I've got my emergency supply kits. I monitor the weather so that I've got as much notice of severe weather. In advance of the severe weather, I'll go out and I'll make sure that the generator is started up and it's running. It gets tested. Maintenance is done every year. I also go in and I do my backups and files, so I've got tertiary backup of electronic information. I can work off my laptop if my desktop goes down. I can work off a cellular, and then I've got a place where I can go to be able to get to a warm spot that would have connectivity, which could be a family member or a friend that lives, maybe a few towns away, assuming I can get there. And also have plenty of snacks as well and beverages.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question that just came in, and I don't know the answer to this, but hopefully you do, Don. Our listener is asking, is there a facility in the U.S. for cold weather firefighting?
A facility in the United States that provides training in cold weather firefighting?
Yes, training.
Okay. I think that every fire department, and I've been a member of 2 different departments, we train for winter weather, and a lot of that is we got to keep more water flowing through our hose lines and protect our equipment during bitter cold, because otherwise it's going to freeze up. We've got to take steps to protect ourselves from frostbite. I got a colleague of mine that to this day, suffered from a little bit of frostbite experience years ago. So it's personnel protection, it's protection of equipment, as well as the public, because of all that water that we're using, creates an ice hazard. But in terms of training, I think it was just part of our training, maybe because we always had to deal with the winter weather. It was just part of our training regimen. I'm not aware of any specific fire school. I think every, state, county fire school, in the north just integrates this into their training. But, Texas A&M has been a big fire training school. Iowa State, I think there are a couple of well-known schools that private sector fire brigades go to. You might want to check with one of those.
Okay, thank you for those additional resources. Our next question is, earlier you mentioned an incident management team, and our listener says, our facilities team handles snowstorms. Why would I need an incident management team?
Incident management team is kind of a generic term. There's been, and I've heard many, many different names for teams that respond to different types of emergencies. So whatever you call your team, it's more important to make sure that that team, whatever team you have, and it might be actually multiple teams. One team might deal with medical emergencies, one might deal with a security issue, a facilities team might deal with facility issues, but you need to manage this maybe more holistically, because there are a lot of commonalities for any of these teams, and they need to come together. as past chair of the NFPA 1600 committee, we wrote a great standard, been out there now for 25 years, that really defines development of that emergency management, business continuity, and crisis management program, and takes a look at organizing, teams, defining roles and responsibility and lines of authority, alerting and communications, pretty much everything I've talked about today, so that you can deal with whatever happens. That's the point. But whatever you want to call it, that's okay. It's just make sure that you can respond effectively to protect employees, your facilities, and your operations.
All right. Our next question is, what are your top lessons learned from severe winter weather?
When winter happens, you never know how bad it's going to be. And sometimes December is just a really tough start to winter with a lot of snow and cold. And then the rest of the winter is easy. Or the winter that I talked about earlier, 2015, where December wasn't bad, first part of January wasn't bad, and then boom, blizzards, cold weather, and 133 inches of snow. So my lesson learned is just got to prepare every winter as if it's going to be a tough one. We're going to get freezing cold weather. We're going to get some snow. Hopefully it's not going to be an ice storm. That's the nightmare. But we just got to be prepared. And the lesson learned is sometimes it's the simple things. It's that small pane of glass I talked about that breaks out, that causes that small 3/4-inch diameter copper tube to freeze up, that results in a $250,000 loss or more. So sometimes it's still the little things.
Okay, thanks, Don. I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to thank everybody who submitted questions, and I want to remind you that if you do have any additional questions or questions we didn't get to today, you can reach out directly to Don at his contact information, which is currently on the screen. I'd also like to say you're welcome to everybody. We've had a number of people have already thanked Don for the resources that he posted on the site and on his slide. And just as a reminder, you will be receiving a copy of his slides tomorrow, so you'll have access to all of those resource links that he provided. So as we wrap up, I'd like to remind everybody as well, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on the Continuity Insights website in a couple of days. If you missed any part of today's broadcast, or if you'd like to share it with your colleagues. So thank you again, Don, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, Winter Weather Preparedness and Response. On behalf of Continuity Insights and our corporate sponsor, OnSolve, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Don. Good day, everyone.